Come for the bread, stay for the politics. I'm Ben Walsh, and this is Let Them Eat Bread. Welcome back. This is the second part of our mega episode on making brioche. As you can see in front of me, I have our dough fresh out of the refrigerator. It has been sitting in the fridge now for about 9 hours. So I'm going to uncover it here and put it onto our lightly floured work surface. Oh, and it's sticking a little bit. That's all right. All right, so you're going to take your dough and put it on there. We're only going to use half the dough. I promised I would show you only how to make one half. Save the other half for later if you want. So we're going to knock out a little bit of the air in it, if there is any. And then we're going to divide our dough roughly in half. This doesn't need to be an exact measure at all. All right. So I'm going to take our other half of our dough and just roughly shape it into a ball and put it back in the fridge to use later. Actually, since it stuck a little bit last time, let's just put a little bit of flour on the bottom. Just a teeny, tiny bit. Remember, we did flour this when it went in before. We don't want to dry out our dough too much. All right, so now we have our one half of dough here. We're gonna use our palms to form it into a rectangle about, let's move some of this flour around here, about 8 inches by 6 inches. So I have a bench scraper here that I'll be using to measure, but roughly, if you have your hand outstretched like this, the distance between your forefinger and your thumb is about 6 inches, and the distance between your thumb to the edge of your pinky will be about the other side. So just a useful thing for measuring there. If you're having trouble shaping it, just move it around, manipulate it a little bit. And our rectangle doesn't have to be perfect because we are going to roll this up into a log. All right, so this side is about where we need it to be, so let's just use the scraper here and get this on. And this side's just a little too wide, so let's bring this in here. Sorry about the noise. There we go. Use our hands here to manipulate the dough into a nice rectangle. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our dough from the long side and just roll it up nice and tight. All right, so now we have a little roll of dough. You can see it's about 8.5 inches long. Perfect. All right, so now what we're going to do, we're going to put our dough in our container here, and we're going to let it sit for 1.25 hours. So for the bread tin, you need to make sure that you grease it first. I have my little pat of butter here for my second loaf that I'll do a little later. And afterwards, you need to make sure also that you have a piece of parchment in there. It'll make it easier to lift it up. You can see with my parchment that I've got it over the edges a little bit. This will allow you to pull it up after it's baked. So this needs to be covered and set to rest for 1 hour and 15 minutes. So let's do that. And this doesn't need to rise warm. This is meant to rise at room temperature. We're going to expect a lot of that rise to come from the oven. Okay. And again, it doesn't have to be super tight. You don't really want it to be super tight. So let's move this to the back here. Set ourselves a timer for 75 minutes. and let's talk some politics. So let me wash my hands real quick, and I will get the whiteboard up, and we can talk some politics today. See what's on the whiteboard. Alrighty, so let's see what we've got today. All right, so let's start with the topic that I have been long promising that I was going to do on the show, modern monetary theory. I talked about it a few weeks back when I was talking about how much money the United States could feasibly spend. I believe it was on infrastructure, but I did want to explain what modern monetary theory is from basic level. There are tons of books out on this. Obviously, I'm not the end-all be-all on it, but just kind of a starting point. What is it? How does it work? Why does it work? Why doesn't it cause inflation? Things like that. So to start, modern monetary theory has a couple of important prerequisites. So the first prerequisite is the country has to manage its own currency. So, for example, in the European Union, if they're a nation that uses the euro, individual countries don't manage the euro. They may manage their own spending of it, but they don't manage the euro. The euro is managed by the European Central Bank, which decides how many euros there are in circulation, and things like that. So the first requirement is a country has to manage its own currency. The second requirement is of modern monetary theory is that the country needs to not have its currency influenced by something else. So what this means is a country that's on the gold standard, for example, couldn't really do this, couldn't really use modern monetary theory, but a country whose sovereign power is the source of the value of its currency is eligible for modern monetary theory. So essentially what that means is, what I mean by that is, if a country, if the worth of a currency is dependent on the strength and trustworthiness and creditworthiness of a particular nation, then that nation is eligible for modern monetary theory. So those are really the only two requirements. Okay, so the way that modern monetary theory works, I think I'll just call it MMT. The way that MMT works is essentially you can spend at the governmental level unlimited amounts of money, and this is because each time that the government is appropriating an expenditure, or it's actively creating money. It's putting that money into the system. They don't have to wait. They're not taking from a bank account and saying, oh, we only have like $12 trillion, so I guess we can only spend, so many trillions of dollars because, whatever. To make sure that there's an even balance sheet. You don't need to do that. And by the way, this is very specific to national governments. So in the United States, state and local governments can't do this because the Constitution prohibits them from going into debt. So one of the other things, it's not really a requirement, but is kind of a requirement for this, for the sake of this argument, is that the country needs to be able, the sovereign entity that's using modern monetary theory needs to be able to go into debt. However, the real reason that states and municipalities are excluded is because they don't manage currency, right? They expend currency, they appropriate currency, but they don't manage currency, right? Only the federal government manages currency. So with that understanding in mind, essentially what modern monetary theory says is that as long as you manage your own currency, you can spend as much of that currency as you want without causing inflation. Now, this may raise some eyebrows, but how is that possible, right? You put so much money into the system, obviously the value of that currency declines. Well, so modern monetary theory has an answer for this, which is taxes. So it doesn't create a balance sheet necessarily, but what it says is you have to use taxes as a means to regulate the amount of currency flowing in the economy. You have to do it taxes aren't in this particular case meant to be punitive or meant to be, indicative of a broader policy goal or implication. Essentially, the only thing is, if you have a graph of supply and demand, you need to just make sure that there is enough demand there needs to be enough demand for the money. And the way that you do that is you curtail supply. And the only way to curtail supply of money in a closed system is through the government taking it back, essentially making it disappear. And by the way, this is made easier because most currency nowadays is digital currency, right? Most of us don't walk around with thousands of dollars in our pocket. We may have a couple hundred in our bank account or whatever. We're not walking around with that much cash. So it's not actually about the physical number of dollar bills in the system, as it were. Modern monetary theory is made easier because most currency is digital, right? It's just ones and zeros in a bank account. It's important to us, obviously, but in terms of the grander economy, it is just numbers, right? And that easily can be moved around. Especially when governments make large appropriations, no one at the Federal Reserve or the Treasury is going in and counting $4 trillion out and handing them to whoever they're being handed to, right? It's being done in such a way that someone just types in a number and zoop, out it goes. So think about something that you think is worth $1. Let's say 4 gumballs. Best reference I could think of. Gumballs are 25 cents now. That's crazy. Anyway, so imagine a gumball, 25 cents. Now you got 4 of them. In your mind, that's worth $1, or whatever you want, right? Something at the dollar store, whatever. Something that's worth $1. Part of the reason that you believe it's worth $1 is because it's being sold to you as $1. Inflation is actually very psychological. It's more about how people feel than about the realities of the economy in a sense. If people believe that that 4 gumballs are worth $1, or whatever metaphor you want to use, $1 will continue to be worth 4 gumballs and vice versa, right? But when people start to feel like the money isn't worth anything, and by the way, this is mainly driven by the mercantile class, and this is the group of people who essentially buy and sell goods. So if you don't think the amount of money that you are spending to get whatever it is worth that, or vice versa, then you start to have problems with inflation. Prices can go up, right, if that dollar doesn't hold some value. Now remember, as I said earlier, the United States is not unique, but the United States currency is essentially, the value of it is essentially set by the creditworthiness of the US government. So the nice thing about MMT is that in order for inflation to happen, the nice thing about any monetary policy is that for inflation to happen, there needs to be a large-scale reassessment of the value of $1 to the point like we had in Weimar, where people didn't believe that the marks were worth what they were worth, and government was reinforcing that policy by inflating the amount of currency in the system and things like that. And of course, if you read the history book, you can find stories about people bringing wheelbarrows of money in for a single loaf of bread, or burning money because it was cheaper than wood, and all sorts of things. But that kind of thing can't really happen under modern monetary theory because of the way that the currency can be regulated to reduce the amount of supply to keep demand about the same. So if you imagine that the government wants to spend a huge amount of money. So during the presidential primaries, Bernie Sanders proposed what I think is a $16 trillion Green New Deal type infrastructure plan, which would, do wonders for the country. Definitely need to go in that direction. But so the immediate question became, well, you're going to put $16 trillion into the U.S. economy. Will that cause inflation? And the answer was always no. And the reason for that was because, Italy paid for in taxes. But that's actually not a correct way to think about it. Paid for means that we have an even balance sheet. That 16 trillion is going out, 16 trillion is coming in. But that's actually not the way that it would work under MMT. So 16 trillion, or whatever number you want to have going out, is going to go out. All that needs to happen on the other side is that government needs to collect enough money in order to make people feel psychologically in the country that there is not so much money in the system that it's no longer worth 4 gumballs. for example. So you actually don't have to do a ton of taxing to create a balance sheet increase. You just have to keep supply and demand, the intersection of supply and demand, somewhere around 4 gumballs, enough so that people don't start to question the value of money, and by someone question the value of money, I mean the mercantile class who's buying and selling goods, right? Prices of goods go up regularly, and people typically don't complain. Oftentimes, businesses will increase the price of things because things increase on their end, cost of living adjustments, yada yada, right? Prices typically tend to increase, but this doesn't break the system either. Even though the prices for things more or less increase across the board, the value is not moved enough in order to create panic in the markets by the mercantile class that there is going to be issues with how much $1 is worth, or how much $1,000 is worth, or whatever it's going to be. So what's interesting is that the United States pretty much believes in modern monetary theory already. We just don't really do the balancing part on the other end. So if you think about how Congress works, so if you think about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the 2017 law that passed under Trump, we had a huge expenditure, not very popular. I think it was 17% popularity, I think. But it was just meant to, it would cut tax across the board. Now, there were lots of issues with the tax law, and it wasn't positive in the slightest, in my personal opinion. But it was essentially putting lots of money into the economy because the government was no longer collecting it, right? So the government said all this money that's currently in the system can stay in the system. We're not going to collect it and essentially make it go away. So the supply of money actually increased a lot. I think it was a couple $1 trillion, $4 or $5 trillion, I think it was. Don't quote me on that. But there was nothing on the demand side that changed significantly. People, we didn't have a ton of, we didn't have a panic in the markets. The same thing happened with the stimulus checks. Stimulus checks were a couple $1 trillion. And that didn't affect the dollar value either. So what these tend to show us is that we can continue to appropriate money more or less any way we want, and the threshold, the tolerance level that the economy has for that type of expenditure is very high, because in the last 4 or 5 years, we've passed, tens of trillions of dollars worth of relief, whether it's direct to consumers, like the 3 sets of stimulus checks, or whether it's direct to corporations, like the $4 trillion of quantitative easing that was done by the Federal Reserve in order to keep the stock market propped up at the beginning of the pandemic. So there's this huge, huge window of opportunity where we can pretty much spend wherever we want. Now, we do have to keep in mind about how much money is actually floating through the system, because eventually we will spend too much. We will get to a point where we're not collecting enough back to keep that supply and demand in check, where it will no longer be 4 gumballs for $1. But the amount of space we have before we get there is actually much larger than people originally believed. So with this, and if the Democratic Party or the leftists in Congress, progressives, whatever you want to call them, by the way, that excludes a huge number of Democrats who are corporate Democrats, bought and owned by corporations, yada yada. We don't count them. But like AOC, Ilhan Omar, and the like, and the Squad, and all of them, they should be pushing modern monetary theory, because the truth is, we already do it. A lot of the times, we don't need to pay for it. The question, how do you pay for it, is asinine in a system like ours, where we manage our own currency and when we have such a high tolerance for the amount of money that's in the system. Now, should we continue to tax people? Yeah, we should. One, because the way that modern monetary theory deals with inflation is by reducing the supply of money in the system, but also because in order to be meritocratic and to maintain our democratic status, we also need to be pulling money from the people who have the most money. Because money in this capitalist system, money is power, right? So you can buy influence with the amount of money that you have. So it's important that we maintain that some people cannot accumulate so much money that they can influence the system and they can have more than one vote. Specifically, this applies to billionaires. And I covered this on the show last week about how there should not be any billionaires. And this is more or less why. But we can actually do that. So Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, Bernie Sanders' wealth tax, taxes for the rich, taxes on offshore investments, a leavers tax, the estate tax, things like that. We have the means to do it. And by the way, once we do that and we can bring the supply of money in the system down a little bit, we then open up so much more space that we can spend without causing real harm to the system. So I hope this has been a good breakdown of what modern monetary theory is, how it works, why it doesn't cause inflation, and why only some governments can implement it. If you need more information on modern monetary theory, there are lots of books out there. I suggest just a quick Google search and you can find them. And if you're in conversation with people who are governing at the national level, talk to them about modern monetary theory. Modern monetary theory is going to open up the door for total nationalization of the healthcare industry, roads and bridges, huge amounts of infrastructure spending, a new deal, a Green New Deal, and also a federal jobs program, fixing our broken immigration system, the amount of money that it needs, decarcerating, creating a decarceral system. All those things require money. Rebuilding our educational institutions, all those things require money. And the tolerance that we have for spending money can actually be much larger than it is now, and much larger than we are being told it is before we actually come up against inflation. We have the political power to do this. The question is, do we have the political will? And the way that we generate political will is we educate our lawmakers about modern monetary theory. We push for modern monetary theory to be adopted completely, even though there is some facets of our government that already believe in modern monetary theory as it is because of the way they act. We need to implement it as actual government policy and then make sure that we are constantly using that justification and waving away the stupid media question of how are you going to pay for it. All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was the devaluation of women's sports. I'm really late to the game here, but I did want to talk about this. There has been, I believe the NCAA championships in March, March Madness was being held in Georgia. A young woman posted that, that the women's sports teams were being devalued because they received much less space than the men's teams, and the facilities that they got weren't as nice, and the supplies they got weren't as, either weren't as nice or weren't as functional as the men's ones. Either way, there were significant differences between what the men's teams had and what the women's teams had. And, the complaint was this was sexist, and sexism's ingrained in the system. And by the way, all that's true in a sense. And the NCAA did come out and apologize, but they made excuses. And then those excuses, like, we didn't have enough space, and that was proven wrong. And it was a whole thing. But I'm sure you already know this because I'm very behind on this story. But I did want to talk about it because I wanted to talk about the intersections between feminism and socialism and sexism and capitalism. So what I mean by this is, if you think about it a little more, it's true that there is sexism in the system. However, I'd like to point out that part of the sexism is us, as a whole, right? When we turn on sports, do we typically go to women's sports? I don't watch really any sports, but the question still stands, right? If you go to turn on a sport, basketball, tennis, soccer, whatever, or football for our European fans, if there are any, what teams are you going to watch? Oftentimes, it's those men's teams. So what happens? Our eyeballs become fixated to the men's sports. So the advertisers see that there are more eyeballs on the men's sports, so they spend their money to advertise there. And that advertising creates deals for the players, who can, get merch and get wealthy, and then translates for all these other things. Essentially, the point I'm trying to make here is capital is going where we're going because we, as a population, have devalued women's sports to be less than men's sports by by directing your eyeballs. Now, while it's true that some of that is historical, as in women's sports were disadvantaged beforehand, but all that is sexism being reinforced with capitalism, being reinforced with more sexism. So it's a vicious cycle that cycles downwards. And in the end of the day, you get these terrible disparities like we saw earlier this year, just last month, with the women's team not having appropriate facilities that the men's teams had. So where does socialism and feminism come into this? Obviously, feminism at its most basic, obviously there are lots of different types of feminism, but the very base feminism is, making sure that women have equal opportunities as men. And that women are treated fairly and equally to men in all circumstances, right? So we need to use feminism to create an equal playing field, no puns intended, between men's sports and women's sports. We can create a culture in which we can reinforce the capitalist forces to give more value to women's sports. Or we could take a socialist approach, which is not to try and change our culture to reinforce capitalism, which will reinforce the culture and yada yada. A socialist approach is to make all of it valued by the sense that that all of the players are workers, men and female, and the approach we give to them is to be able to run their own leagues and to find their own sponsorships and things like that, as opposed to being done from the outside, right? In a socialist culture, these teams will decide who they want to work with. And there are good feminist organizations out there, and I'm sure there are even companies who believe that women are an important part of the market that they can, solicit consumer goods to. So you take that kind of that restructuring of our culture from a capitalist one to a socialist one, and because socialism is about creating equality, about democratization of workspaces and living spaces, you create an equal playing field, again, no puns intended, between women's sports and men's sports, because they're valued the same by society, because society sees them just as workers. And this isn't a class reductionist argument, by the way. This is an intersection between feminism, whose purpose primarily is to equate the sexes, that's an old way of thinking, to equate men and women, and socialism, which is to equate all workers, right? So we have this opportunity here to think about it from a high-level political, cultural perspective. But in the meantime, what we can do to help women's sports now is just watch them more. Because again, until we can overthrow this capitalist system, the money is simply going to go where the eyeballs are. The sexism in advertising, the sexism in media is just a reflection of the sexism in our society that we all hold collectively. So whether you are a sexist or not, or what have you, if you are going to watch a sport next time, turn into a women's sport. Because the more eyeballs we can put on this, the more the capitalist forces that control where the money goes, where the resources go, they're going to follow them too. It's not a perfect solution, and obviously the perfect solution would just be to get rid of this system that reinforces the sexism and to create true equality. But until we do that, we need to play on these capitalist forces and trick them into doing the right thing. And I hope that, if more people tune in, we will not see a repeat of the type of blatant sexism and unfair distribution of resources that we saw in NCAA March Madness, which I'm sure, by the way, is reflected in other sports that are just less prominent and we don't see as much. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, just because it's a little poignant, is stranded ships and global capitalism. So you may have heard that the company Evergreen's ship, the Ever Given, got a little stuck in the Suez Canal recently. It's just been freed a couple of days ago, but essentially slowed down all cargo shipping from China, India, and those areas to Europe and the Americas, because it's much slower to have to go around the bottom of Africa. I forget which cape it is. I think it's the Cape of Good Hope. To go around the Cape of Good Hope and come all the way back up to Europe or to the Americas. The Suez Canal is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle where it comes to international trade and the flow of international capital. And also, of course, Egypt collects tolls on every ship that goes through there, so it's an incredibly important resource for Egypt as well. So how does this have to do with global capitalism, you ask? It was just some wind that blew the ship into a rock and it caused it to run aground. So the reason that's related to capitalism is twofold. One, the size of these ships continues to get larger because the demand to move consumer goods around the world continues to get larger, right? The Ever Given had some several thousand containers on it traveling through the Suez, and the boat was absolutely monstrously huge. And by the way, if you know anything about how wind works, right, if you have a large straight up and down wall that can be moved and the wind pushes up against it, it's going to move, right? No matter how heavy it is, provided that it's moving on something where there's no, this will get a little too physicsy here, but if there's no coefficient of static friction, or there's very little coefficient of static friction, like a ship on the water, then the amount of wind that can push against a large flat surface, you can really start to move that ship. And that's what happened, right? The ship was simply a giant wall that was able to move. The wind caught it, and it went aground. But the reason that has to do with capitalism is because the constant demand of constant growth and infinite economics and infinite increases has made it so that these ships need to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they have to carry more and more stuff. And the ship then becomes more difficult to pilot because it's more subject to the forces around it. But also, and more importantly, the Suez Canal isn't getting any bigger, right? Oftentimes, its borders are fixed. You can't make it bigger. You can redredge it, you can make it deeper, but you can't make it wider. So as these ships get larger to respond to the demands of global capital and global capitalism, the ships continue, the canal doesn't get any bigger. So it's much more likely that ships get caught in the canal because of the way that demand is going. And the more ships that are in there, the more likely this is to happen. And of course, the pressure is always more ships, more cargo, bigger ships, bigger cargo, because it's more profit for the people who run these companies. So obviously, we need to keep in mind that we cannot have an infinite growth economy in a planet with finite resources, and that the solution is not, thank you Elon Musk, to go to other planets and destroy them, but the solution is to scale back our global consumerism, to reduce, reuse, and recycle where we can, and to make sure that there is no need for this constant growth, this constant making of ships bigger, making of the cargo heavier, making the containers bigger. Because if we do, we're literally throwing a cog in the works, because things will get stuck again. Capital will slow down again. And even though the rich are not affected most of the time when this happens, if global stock markets fall because of a failure of capital to move around, it's regular working people who lose their jobs. It's regular working people who suffer the consequences that have to go on breadlines. And this is especially true in America, when the stock market tanked in 2008, and again just a few years ago. The rich were fine because the rich were bailed out, or they had enough money, or they had insurance, or they were bailed out by insurance, or they were bailed out by governments. Regular people, though, lost their jobs so the rich could keep their hegemony. So if we can reduce the amount of consumerism that we are participating in, that we are fed every day of our lives, every commercial telling you have to buy this new thing, especially non-consumable goods and non-perishables, the less we use, the less need there is for this constant growth. Companies will still try and get us to buy more things, but we have the power. We are the consumer audience that's being marketed to, and we can take a stand if we work together to reduce the amount of shipping moving, to reduce the chance that there's a big issue with a ship getting stuck or with cargo being lost and things like that. And while that mostly affects the rich, they always trickle that hurt down to the poor. The second thing about global capitalism this brought up is that this is someone brought to my attention that the Ever Given and the Evergreen, I'm going to get this wrong, but the company who made it, I think, is a Taiwanese company, and the company who owns it is a Japanese company, but the ship is registered in Panama. So that doesn't make any sense, right? Why would a ship that is traveling internationally, that's owned by a Japanese company, that's built by a Taiwanese company, be registered in Panama? And the reason is because of race to the bottom international politics, especially, and this is especially true of shipping. So if you've ever been on a cruise ship, you'll notice that all the cruise ships have fly a flag of like Bermuda or Panama or some other small Caribbean country. And the reason they do this is for the giant tax breaks. If they were to fly the flag of the United States or of a European country or Canada or Mexico or whatever, there are large scale regulations that regulate, that require these companies to pay huge amounts of corporate tax. But because a ship can be anywhere, if you register it to another country, you can force it so that you can force the system such that you don't have to pay as many taxes to there. And that's what's happening with the Evergreen, is being registered, the Ever Given being registered in Panama. The only reason they did that is to avoid taxes. This is just one more step in the giant international scheme that the rich use to hide their money. Hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars are being hidden in offshore accounts in laundered places, such as the Swiss banks or oh my gosh, what's the name? The Cayman Islands and things like that, right? We had the Panama Papers just a couple of years ago. Remember the Panama Papers telling us that the rich had this complex scheme to hide money all over the world. Boats are part of it because they can be registered anywhere. Now, there's a solution for this, and that's actually a fairly simple solution. Okay, you want to be registered in a particular country. That's fine. Do whatever you want. So there are two solutions, right? The first solution is, okay, well, if you're going to register in country X, in order to avoid paying our taxes, then you can't do business here. Now, this isn't a great solution, in my opinion, because what it says is, if every country took this approach, ships would have to be registered in multiple places. Now, that could possibly be a good thing. I don't know enough about the international maritime taxes in order to know whether that makes sense. But the idea would be that you have to register then in every place that you're going to do business, and by registering there, pay taxes there. Because if not, the country will simply deny you access to port, which obviously ships need because they have human beings on it, and the humans need to eat. But also because the ships need refueling and all the other obvious reasons that ships have to dock somewhere. The other solution is to say that, okay, you can be registered anywhere you want. You want to pay your annual taxes in Panama, you want to pay your annual taxes in the Cayman Islands, you want to pay them in Quebec, who cares? Whatever, do what you want, okay? But anytime that you come to port, you have to pay a tax right then and there. You have to pay it either on the value added of the goods you're bringing in, or you have to do it on the value added of the goods you're taking out, or you have to pay a service tax depending on what types of services you're offering, right? And these could be set per cap. So for a cruise ship, you might do it per capita, right? So you pay, I'm just making up numbers here, but like $130 a head. So if you have that was a terrible number. Let's just use 100 to make my math much easier. So if you have 3,000 people on your ship, you leave the United States with 3,000 people. Okay, the moment you leave, you need to cut a check to the U.S. government, or Florida or California or whatever, for $300,000, right? Just right there, that's the tax you pay to have the privilege of taking those people out. And look, the truth is, no matter what happens, the cost will be passed down to the consumer because that's how corporations work. Their bottom line will always be their bottom line, and the preference for a corporation is just to pass any costs that it can reasonably pass on to the consumer. But what it does is it forces some of that profit to come into governments who are helping maintain these ships, right? By having places in the dock. They're helping maintain the industry by having places that these ships can go. But unfortunately, this takes an international effort. Like I spoke about on the program a few weeks ago, if there's not an international effort for these types of endeavors, what happens is that countries realize that if they opt out, they can get all the business, much like Delaware does with corporate taxes in the United States, right? Every company and their shell company is registered in Delaware. Why? Cheap corporate taxes, right? All these ships, right? If there's an international treaty and say Panama says, well, everyone else has signed it, but we don't have to. And because we don't have to, we can get all the business, right? We can make a volume-based profit by having all these ships and things come in to us. So any international effort that is done for this has to be wholly inclusive and needs to include some form of punitives for countries that don't ascribe to it. Because if not, you're going to severely limit the efficacy of such a program. Now, there is one caveat to this that I do want to point out that I think is just kind of important. Some of this is influenced by consumer demand. So, for example, if we were to do an international levers tax and every country was to use that, is it true that countries that opt out, countries that opt out of it would have more business? Yeah, it is. But at some point, the corporation realizes that the consumer base is too active to ignore. So there's a good chance that even if you were to use a type of levers tax like this, you'd still have ships coming into harbors where it was expensive for them to do business. They would just raise the price of tickets, or they find another way to recoup that cost, because the amount of money coming into them from the consumers from that country is too valuable to give up. This is actually an argument that's made, this is a little bit off topic, but this is an argument that's made for increasing the corporate taxes in America and increasing working standards in America, and using things like a levers tax or an offshore tax, or or using tax breaks for companies that create jobs in the United States, putting taxes even on companies that create jobs in the United States. The argument for that is the American market is just too big, too consumer focused to ignore. It may be more expensive to manufacture your goods here, to take your ship here, or whatever, but there's so many people who are going to buy so much of it, they will make a profit. It will not hurt them too much it will not hurt them so much that they will move their business elsewhere. And of course, the issue, and this comes back to the global capitalism thing, is that, capital can move. The rich have enough money that they can leave whatever it is, where it is, abandon it, and build up a new shop tomorrow somewhere else. Capital is fluid. Capital moves all over the world. The Panama Papers prove that. But labor is not fluid. It's very hard for people to move. Either you're locked in a lease or you own a home. Oftentimes you are stuck in places for a particular amount of time. It's hard to just get up and move. Now in the remote economy, it's a little easier, but still, it's hard to transcend national boundaries and things. But capital can move facilely. I don't know if that's a word, but capital can move in a facile manner to anywhere in the world. They can just pick up one place and put down in another. So we need to use national policy to root out the race to the bottom type international politics that we experience with places like Panama and the Cayman Islands, but also I forgot what I was going to say. But yeah, so we need to use international forces to make sure that capital doesn't move around as much, because the more the capital moves, or to punish capital when it does move, because the more the capital moves, the more it hurts labor. Okay. That one a little longer than I thought it was going to, but I do have some other things I want to talk about. So, speaking of international commerce, you may have seen, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, again, I'm really behind on this, I apologize, there just wasn't time for politics in the Matzah episode, that Secretary Yellen, Janet Yellen of the Treasury, was looking to implement, was looking to encourage the implementation of an alternative international minimum corporate tax. So what would that mean? So if you filed your taxes, you may have heard something about the alternate minimum tax. So the alternate minimum tax is essentially to say, if you make such and such amount of money and you qualify for all these loopholes, you can't get away with paying nothing. Now some corporations do, but this is the alternate minimum tax applies primarily to individuals. So it says that as an individual, if you make a certain amount of money and you qualify for a certain number of loopholes such that you would pay less than a certain amount of tax calculated by your income, you instead pay that alternate minimum tax instead. So say I make $100 million. And I qualify for all these loopholes, I would have to pay, I don't know, let's just make the numbers easy, $10,000 in taxes this year. If the alternate minimum tax says, well, actually you have to pay $27,000, again, just making numbers up, then I would have to pay that $27,000 figure instead of the $10,000 figure, which is what I would actually pay if there was no alternate minimum tax, which, because of all the things that I qualify for. The idea of an alternate minimum tax is to make sure that everyone pays something into the system, that some base level of taxation is collected from all income. And this is for the purpose of just making sure that people aren't getting away with making massive amounts of money and not contribute from the societies that they are in while not contributing to those societies whatsoever. So the alternate minimum tax is a good thing. It should probably be higher than it is, but that's a discussion for another day. What would an international alternate minimum tax look like? So this is hard to say, and the question really becomes, is it enforceable? It probably isn't. As I mentioned in my last segment just a second ago, the issue with international treatises and things like that is you always have a race, you always trigger race to the bottom politics. You will always have some country or some actor who says that I can gain by not being in lockstep with this treaty or agreement and allowing for these corporations to come spend their money with me instead, right? So it's difficult to see why this would be proposed if it's not enforceable, but let's just say for a moment it is enforceable. What would it look like? So essentially it would say that every nation, you would say, let's just take a retail company, for example. So say you're a retail company and you operate in Sweden. Why not? Just think of random countries. And you operate in Sweden. Sweden would say, all right, for any goods and services that you sell here, regardless of where they're made, you are going to pay so much tax on them. So regardless of where that country's based, they'd have to do that. And every country would have some number that they said, based on, whatever volume of goods or the net, or the gross worth of services performed or goods and services. Yeah, that's pretty much it, just goods and services. So you would use some calculation to evaluate the amount of goods or services being brought into a country from abroad or wherever, and any company that wasn't based in Sweden would pay that tax to do business in Sweden. It's essentially a right to do business tax. Whereas companies that were based in Sweden would be exempt from that tax to encourage companies to move to Sweden and create jobs there and do business there, right? So you could have an international company that had a workforce in Sweden that could dodge the tax that way. But it's not really a tax dodge because the national government is benefiting from the corporation's presence there, provided that they're paying the requisite national taxes, and that there is some alternate minimum tax involved for corporations and things like that. So in theory, this is great, right? Because every country essentially says, no matter where your goods are manufactured, once they come here, you have to pay taxes on them. Now, it's true that this would increase the price of goods a little bit, But corporations are actually quite good at either absorbing these costs or passing them off to consumers in a way that doesn't make them that doesn't make the product so expensive that it won't be purchased. Remember, corporations have many options by which to make profit. They can either make profit on individual items, they can make profit on bulk items, they can undercharge for some and overcharge for others. They can use volume profits. There's lots of ways that corporations can make money. So this tax idea, again, would be great if you could get everyone to do it. Because if you don't, now again, caveat about some consumer markets being too large to avoid, but for the most part, the issue would then become race to the bottom politics, because countries would simply just decide they don't want to sell products in some markets because of the tax. And again, by the way, it would be about an enforcement mechanism, right? So you'd have to find a way on an international scale to punish companies who don't adhere to this, or to punish countries that don't adhere to it, and thus making their cost of business lower. And there's really no good way to do that except for by force and imperialism. And as a socialist, I'm inherently opposed to those things. But also, I personally don't believe in those things, regardless of the fact that I'm a socialist. So it's an interesting idea, and I mean, I'm not going to give props to Janet Yellen for proposing it, but it's an interesting idea that if there was a real effort to get it moving, to really do it, then it would be good. But if there's not going to be that kind of momentum for that kind of idea, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to try and implement it because you're going to create the same types of issues that you have with all international commerce, which is race to the bottom politics and economics. Okay. Wow, we are flying through time today. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, you may have seen in the news lately, Ted Cruz's stupid video of himself taking a selfie video by the border. He claims it's by the border. Who knows? He may have just pulled up to some random shrub in the middle of the night and taken a video there. But he did actually go into a migrant detention facility and took video there. And you can see that the migrants that are there are living in terrible and squalid conditions that were not okay under Trump, conditions that are not okay now. I will point out that Ted Cruz and the Republicans that went there were perfectly silent about this when it was Trump that was doing it, but that hypocrisy meter broke a long time ago for people like Ted Cruz, so quite frankly, I'm not going to press on it too much. What I will say too, by the way, is, Democrats who are yelling and screaming about it under and this is like normie Democrats, corporate Democrats who are screaming about it under Trump, no longer screaming about it under Biden. Come on. Principles, people. But the issue is the same, right? We have lots of people coming here. We don't know what to do with them. We are significantly struggling to house them, to resettle them in an appropriate manner to process their cases. So I wanted to take a look at, why do immigrants come here? And why do they leave their homes? Because I don't know about you, but it would take a lot for me to completely leave my home, everything I've ever known and loved, and go to a country I've never been to with a language I don't speak to start over. And I mean, I spent most of my life in this state, let alone this country. There's not many other places I could go. So why? Why do people do it? So in order to answer this question, we need to, so there are some of the obvious answers, right? Like this gang violence, the cartels and things like that. But to say it that way removes from the equation the actual cause of many of these problems. So during the so to go back into history a little bit, during the Cold War, the world was essentially split into three camps. By the way, this is where the terms First World and Third World come from. So the First World was the United States and its allies and its sphere of influence, which, by the way, was just the Western Hemisphere. And then you had the Soviets, the Soviet Union, and their sphere of influence, which was mostly the Eastern Hemisphere, right? East, West? Yeah, the Eastern Hemisphere, and their sphere of influence, or the Eastern Bloc, right? And then you had, that was called the Second World. And then you had mostly African countries but countries that were not really aligned on either side. These were countries that were newly independent from Britain, France, Germany, and Spain, who were and Portugal, who were realizing that that were breaking the yoke of colonialism and were becoming free and national bodies in their own right. And this was called the Third World. And essentially, there was these fights to have dominance in the Third World. You know, who has more of the Third World? It was essentially a large-scale international chess match. The reason I bring this up is because the United States executed its sphere of influence in many South American countries. So during the post-World War II era, many of these South American countries had the good sense to have socialist revolutions. This includes some famous ones: Chile, Nicaragua, Panama, and all those. And so the United States wasn't a fan of that because the immediate instinct that you had once you had your socialist revolution was to ally yourself with the Soviets, which of course violated the American sphere of influence thing and yada yada. So again, the reason I bring this up is because America then led violent coups in many of these countries. We installed Pinochet in Chile. We trained guerrillas in Nicaragua that blew up ships and harbors and things. We essentially created tons and tons and tons of violence, civil wars. We used the CIA to overthrow elected governments. We've been fiddling about in Bolivia and Venezuela for a very long time. The Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. So all these things are to say we created very violent conditions in these countries. The other thing we did was Nixon criminalized all sorts of drugs, right? So the war on drugs starts. So what happens? Instead of having regular markets where normal business can be conducted, you have all these black markets popping up. And with the black market comes the violence that can be utilized to control black markets. So we see the beginnings of the cartels. There are plenty of shows about it. I'm sure you guys have heard of Narcos and kind of some of the similar shows kind of documenting, as it were, kind of what's going on in Mexico and with the drug trade and things like that. But none of that would have been possible without the United States saying these were illegal. Now, demand in the United States didn't decrease any. People still wanted cocaine. They still wanted their heroin. They still wanted their morphine. They still wanted their cannabis, right? But it was now, they still wanted their PCP, MDMA, whatever. But now, because it was illegal to get it, you had to, you created an atmosphere where people can be violent to secure supply lines. So, and because, by the way, this business is incredibly lucrative, the more goods you can get out, the more profits you can make, and like any other capitalist business. But this one involved guns, right? So, because different groups of people wanted to take control of these trades, they were using weapons. Oftentimes, weapons that they got a hold of because of American intervention, not to help them out, but just Americans dropping guns in other places or things like that. And by the way, the Pentagon's incredibly inefficient, and we lose tons of weapons all the time. So it's not really surprising they got their hands on the goods as far as guns go. So, and not just guns, by the way, we're talking like, military vehicles, tanks, military aircraft, tons of stuff. But anyway, the point of all that is we created incredibly violent conditions in these countries. So, and the cartels need to recruit somehow, and these gangs need to recruit somehow, and the way they do it is through violence, because people typically don't want to join these groups. If you ask most people, they're going to tell you they don't want to smuggle drugs in their butt or their stomach, and they definitely don't want to get arrested, and they don't want to die, and all these other things. So violence is used to force cartel membership. So we create these incredibly violent conditions. They continue to get more violent because they need to expand and to grow. Again, that kind of capitalist notion. And of course, there's political instability because of the way that America has destabilized many of these governments using coups to get what they want. And so people leave because it's too violent and too dangerous to stay. And where do they go? If they go to another Latin American country, there aren't really a ton of Latin America in countries that America hasn't touched with its coups and its CIA and its military. So the next logical place to go is to America, which is quite resilient to being dispatched with a right-wing coup, most probably because, well, I don't say, well, we are most resistant to a CIA-backed coup, I think, of all the countries around the world. The US is probably the most resistant to that kind of forced change of government from the CIA. But, who knows? Maybe they'll prove me wrong. Don't do that, guys. Don't do that. But so they come here because they see it as a safe place. And by the way, America is a land of immigrants. We have always been. We always will be. The only people who are not immigrants are the Native Americans. Even if you were born here, your family most likely came from somewhere else. So that aside, immigrants are great. If you don't like immigrants, you don't like America. Sorry. Not sorry. So anyway, so that's why they come here, right? They pick up what they have. And by the way, when you are fleeing, it's the holiday of Passover, so it's actually a great time to talk about this. When you're fleeing somewhere, you don't have time to take all your stuff and to gather all your things. Oftentimes, when you're leaving a violent situation, you just go. Everything can be replaced, but your life and the people that you hold dear. So in order to, you take what little things you can carry and you go. And these caravans form, by the way, because if you're going alone, it's unsafe, right? The cartels can track you. If they're threatening you, they've probably cased you already. They know they're following you, they're watching you. But if you join up in these large caravans, it's much harder, strength in numbers type of thing. So that's why we get this fear-mongering about the caravans. These people are just trying to leave the violence that we created for them. And then when they come here, they're experiencing more violence. We are letting these people down in every single way imaginable. They leave their countries, and there's terrible violence there that we've created primarily. They come here to a different type of violence, to the violence of the system, right? To being locked in these migrant chambers in squalid conditions. Because look, they've done the calculus. Like, this type of thing doesn't deter them, because at least in America, they get to live. It might be a shit life, but the life that they get to live is a life. They get to have their family members. Maybe there's some family already here that they can rejoin with. If they stayed, the cartel would have killed them, right? So these calculations are being made by people who are in terrible, terrible situations. When we talk about immigration, we're making these kinds of assumptions that people, are acting in ways that are acting in ways that we would, because we're sitting in comfort and we can't really understand the difficulty that they have, coming to, making these types of decisions. And even though they know it's bad here, they come here because there's a chance to live, where we took that away from them. We, as in America, took that away from them in their home country. So I hope that helps you understand why immigrants come here, why they bother leaving their homes in the first place. They don't make that choice lightly. I don't want you to think that they're coming here as like some vacation home. No, these people have given up everything they owned, that and everything they ever loved, to flee for their lives to come here. The least we can do is treat them with dignity and respect. And I don't mean the dignity and respect of not showing their squalid conditions on camera. I mean the dignity and respect of actually creating a welcoming environment for them to come to, processing their cases quickly and efficiently, and allowing them to live here and work the jobs that Americans don't want to work, which is primarily what they come here to do. It is disgraceful that immigration policy has been this bad my entire life. I have never known a time when our immigration policy was good. Bush failed, Obama failed, Trump failed, and Biden's failing now. There are solutions. Listen to the people on the ground who are doing the work to make sure that these people who are coming here have a place to go. There are solutions. We just have to have the political will to do them, and we need to dial back, and not even just dial back. We need to eliminate the terrible racism and xenophobia which we ascribe to the people who are fleeing for their lives from their countries that we destroyed. Okay. So there was an interesting development. Next thing I want to talk about is in Europe. So the European Union just passed a right to repair law. So what is a right to repair law? So a right to repair law says that companies have to provide parts, replaceable parts, for particular appliances, things like TVs, washers, dryers, fridges, and things, stovetops, for 10 years. This is what this particular law says. And they have to do that, and they also have to make these devices with in such a way that they can be repaired at home. So they need to come with an instruction manual, and they need to be able to be opened up with, say, like a screwdriver, like a standard screwdriver or a hammer or whatever. So you may notice how many of the appliances you've had. I don't know if you've ever tried to replace an appliance, but oftentimes the screws that they use have very special heads. Either you need a hex wrench or a square wrench or things like that are either difficult or impossible to come across. Or it can't be opened without a special key that only the manufacturer has. And of course, this leads to issues of planned obsolescence, where a corporation essentially makes the calculation: we can create products that last only up until the warranty and then cease to function. And then you need to replace it, right? And this is how they can generate long-term profits. Cell phones are like this, by the way. You find that your phone will stop working magically 2 years after you buy it, which is just in time for that warranty to wear out. So they don't have to replace it. It doesn't cost them anything, but you have to buy a new phone, which is going to give them lots of money. So what a right to repair law is a pushback against planned obsolescence, and the European Union just passed it. And congratulations to our friends in Europe, because it is a really, really great law, and we should have something like it in the United States, because people want to repair their stuff, right? Oftentimes, people don't want to buy new things, probably because these things are very expensive and it's just cheaper to repair them. It may be, a little bit more expensive in the long run to repair it, but how many? It's hard to say if that's true, but also, people typically like the things they have. They want to keep using them, and as long as they still work, we want to keep using them. So the ability to repair things is also a pride thing. It also reduces. It's also an environmentally friendly thing, because the more things that we repair, the fewer things have to be replaced. The fewer things that have to be replaced, the less demand there is for these great big new appliances and things. And the less trash is generated, because people just aren't throwing things away willy-nilly, when one part of one thing breaks. And it's especially important that this law included a manual requirement written in plain vernacular, so that regular people can fix, like, a fridge or a stovetop. It says, if such and such a thing stops working, this is how you replace it, or this is how you repair it. This is a phenomenal law. I do not know if it could ever get passed in the United States. I think it'd be very difficult. I think the corporate lobby for retail giants is just too big, and they would not want to sacrifice that level of profit by allowing people to purchase repairable items. But it's a huge win. It's a huge win for the environment. It's a huge win for the people who are going to be using these products and who are going to get a lot more mileage out of their products than they would have before. And it's a win for ordinary working people, which I'm always happy to report on here. Now, obviously, some things can't be done this way, so like cars or mobile homes or some things like that. But who knows? Maybe one day we'll get to a point where replaceable parts for cars and things are possible too. I just don't know, but I think this is a great start to help reduce the amount of trash that we create, because there is a lot of trash on this planet, and we need to do something to get rid of it and to stop creating so much of it, because it's killing our planet. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about today, and hopefully I have enough time to do it. If not, we'll just kind of plow through until we do, is I want to talk about universal basic income and the idea of money for nothing. So what is universal basic income? So universal basic income is essentially a tax-free stipend that you get just for existing. So that sounds great. So essentially, the government pays you, I don't know, $2,000 a month just for living in this country. And this is important because it allows the government to provide for people's basic needs, to look at, to make sure that everyone has the very basics. So the universal basic income is essentially meant to cover, at the very least, and what I call basic income, is your housing, your food, your utilities, and any other kind of expenses that you need to live. So if we were to get something like this in America, it would fundamentally transform the economy. Not just because people would have more money to spend on other things, but also because workers would be empowered. So what do I mean by that? So when you guys talked about, oftentimes the argument, well, you're going to give people money to do nothing at all. And so the reason that that's brought up is to kind of make you is to make you have the reactionary thought of, oh, you can't have money, you can't have a decent life unless you earn it. You can only earn it by, working your fingers to the bone and working a job you don't like, and just keep trudging through and never having any time to do anything other than work. But because that's the propaganda that we're taught our whole lives. If you work hard, you'll do well. If you work hard, if you work hard, if you work hard, if you get a good job, if you get promoted, right? But really, the answer is, I reject that framing, because it actually is a good thing for people to get money for not doing anything, because if they do, then they will have more opportunities to do things that they love doing. I always think, when I think about universal basic income, I always think about the old promise of capitalism, which is that by working these jobs, by, existing in this system that attempts to create more growth and more efficiency, is that eventually we'll work less. We'll enjoy our lives more. The promise of capitalism was to work less and live more. But that's not been the case. The case has been that the capitalist class, the bourgeois, have constantly, the owners of the means of production, have constantly squeezed more labor out of their workers and have made our living conditions more and more disparate. It has been harder to pay rent. It has been harder to pay utilities. The prices go up, but wages don't. There's that old cartoon from, I think, the 1920s, where a man is squished between two wooden platforms, and the top one says high rent, and the bottom one says, the top one says low wages, and the bottom one says high rent. And the capitalist is up there screwing them tighter and tighter and squeezing the worker more and more. This is what's happening. And it's the same thing that's happening now that had been happening all the way back in the 1920s. For the most part, people's standard of living, even if it's gone up, hasn't gone up by so much that they've really started to enjoy life, that they've had the opportunity to do other things. Money for nothing gives the power to the worker, because it says, well, actually, I have enough to live, to pay rent. Now, maybe I don't have enough to go on vacation, or I don't have enough to go out to fancy restaurants and things, or to buy luxury goods, or even to buy extra consumer goods that I want. But any income I make on top of this basic income is disposable for the most part. my basic needs are met. And by the way, just a quick aside on that, UBI would have to be different based on the cost of living in different places. But $2,000 a month typically would cover people's basics for most areas of the country. Obviously, there's some places where that wouldn't be true, and UBI would have to be higher, but that aside. So this workers then have the opportunity to say, actually, I don't want to work. I want to paint all day, or I want to sit in my garden and read every book I can possibly get my hands on from the library all day. Or I want to bake bread and give it to my neighbors all day. Or I want to play video games all day. Or I want to write books and not have to worry about the profit margin or my side hustle or whatever. I want to garden for a living. Not even for a living. I want to garden for fun. Like that's what I want to do with my life. We give all these options back to workers, and then the corporations have to respond by creating a workplace environment that's actually welcoming. So instead of paying you a starvation wage, they actually have to pay you a real wage. They have to give you real benefits. They have to make maybe all work becomes part-time or something like that. Companies then have to start appealing to workers as opposed to the other way around. Right now, if you want a job, you have to appeal to a company and say, yes, I will work super hard for you, and I'll work weekends, and I'll never take any time off, and I'll come in when I'm sick, and I'll work 16-hour days. I mean, I don't know how people working 16-hour days, but you get the idea, right? You have to ingratiate yourself to the great corporation. But if the system was the other way around, you wouldn't have to do that. Companies would have to ingratiate themselves to the workers. They'd say, "Oh, workers, well, we need you," and they would need to create an environment that's safe, that's friendly, that's welcoming, that's fun, that's enjoyable for workers, because all work would be voluntary. Nowadays, we have what's often referred to as wage slavery, whereas people are indentured to their employers because the wages are so low they barely cover anything, so you work harder and harder and more jobs in order to make sure that you have, to make sure that you can pay your bills. But if your bills are already covered and there's no need for you to work, the power dynamics change fundamentally. So I am in full support of people receiving money for nothing. I'm in full support of people who don't want to work for a living. I think that in 2021, you should have the option to sit at home and not work if you don't want to. And that's not a crazy thing. We should normalize a culture where work isn't everything. If you want to work, the conditions that you work should be up to you for the most part. Obviously, if you really believe in a company's purpose, you don't want to work extra and things like that, that's on you. But that's the point. It should be on the worker. The worker should be making these decisions for themselves. And this doesn't just occur in places where there's a union or places where there are employee-owned companies. This can occur because the worker actually has the power to say, no, I refuse. I'm not going to work at a job that pays me starvation wages, that makes me work in dangerous working conditions. I don't have to. My basic needs are met. I'm gonna sit in a park and read books all day instead. If this factory wants to hire me, if this factory wants me to work for it, then they can create a situation that is going to be safe and comfortable for me to work in. And if they're not willing to do that, then they can go bankrupt because they'll have no workers to make their goods. And if that was the case, you would see a fundamental shift in the way that work and labor is understood in this country and in all countries. There have been so many studies that show, and I want to get to the other argument that's brought up to it. I just want to address really quickly because I think it's kind of stupid. Is people just get lazy. If you just give them money, they'll be lazy. No, they won't be. What's funny is, first of all, there's tons of studies just proving this, and that people take the money they get from UBI and they save it and they spend it appropriately, and they buy themselves better living conditions and things like that. As if you have to spend it on any such thing. It's your money, you can spend it on whatever you want. But the thing is, it's not that people will be lazy. It's that people will be lazy if you only see laziness through the eye of creating capital for the capitalist class. right? The person who stays at home and reads books all day, they're not being lazy. Or the person who plays video games all day, they're not being lazy. They are doing something. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with being lazy. You don't have to produce. You don't have to work all the time. This is a cultural problem that we have where we believe that everything has to be tied to work. No, reject that. Let universal basic income be the way that we go. And let's move to a place where the workers control whether they are going to work or not, how they're going to spend their days, and how they're going to be productive. Because being productive doesn't just mean creating capital for the capitalist class. It can mean anything. And the more that we recognize that truth, the happier we'll become and the less we'll feel like we're overworked. All right, so that was our timer you heard in the background there. So now what we're going to do is we are going to uncover our bread if it's ready. And it should have doubled in size by now. If it hasn't, just keep it going. It will get there eventually. What we're going to do now is we're going to preheat our oven to 350 degrees. You're going to do this. I'm not going to do this on camera. We're going to do this off camera. Once the episode ends, you're going to preheat your oven to 350 degrees. You're going to brush with a single egg, a little egg wash here. And then after you do that, you're going to let it cook for 30 to 35 minutes. It's suggested that you cook it in the center rack of the oven. If you're cooking 2 loaves at once, you didn't just do 1 loaf like I did, you will want to put it in. You'll want to switch them around about 20 minutes in to ensure even browning. All right. I can't wait to see your bread when you bake it this week, and I will see you next week for another episode of Let's Make Bread. Take care, everyone.